Welcome to Move the Chains with Jonathan Rivers. Here's your host, Jonathan Rivers.
Let there be football. Welcome into the show. I'm your boy, Jonathan Bam Rivers. And the NFL is phenomenal in my opinion. And the season is getting closer, and I'm getting that much more excited. Now, the schedule release came out, and we already know that. I talked about it on last week's show. But there are a lot of people who like to choose teams on what their records will be based on what they think will happen. Well, I do it a little differently, and I'll show that to you today on First Down. Also, more questions from social media regarding you, the fans, and what your outlook may be on the 2024 season. And my nonsense narrative today, the Coach of the Year award, is it simply an overachiever's award relative to the expectations of that team and that coach that season? I'll definitely go into that in detail. And on the final drive, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to tell you why production has and should always trump potential. But you know how we do it. Let's kick it off with First Down. So I'm not the type of guy to sit here and try to predict the wins and losses for a team throughout the season. You've probably heard me say it before, but I want to make sure that I can illustrate it vehemently once now. You cannot predict injury. You cannot predict in-season trades. You cannot predict what a team will look like throughout the duration of a season. I might say a team wins a division, they might win 12 games. Well, I don't know where those 12 games are going to come from. So rather than do that, because I think it's pretty nearsighted to do something like that, I like to do what's called floor and ceiling, or worst case scenario, best case scenario. So I picked a couple of teams this year that I want to go over. We'll throw that graphic up. And I'm going to start with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. The Tampa Bay Buccaneers won the NFC South last season. And if you can see here, their ceiling, in my opinion, which means best case scenario for the Bucs, or 12 wins, which means they would be 12-5. And worst case scenario would be 6 losses. So that tells me, in my estimation, I think the Bucs are a relative strong team, but it's also based on the division in which they play. What they have is something that people don't realize. They've got an all-pro safety in Antoine Winfield Jr., but they've also got, I think, one of the most underrated players that have ever played at the NFL level, and that's Mike Evans. Not one receiver, not Jerry Rice, not Randy Moss, not Jamar Chase, not John Stallworth, not Lynn Swann. I don't care where you go when it comes to receivers over the history of the NFL. Not one receiver has had 1,000 yards in 10 straight seasons like Mike Evans has to start his career. He's been a Pro Bowler 4 times, and he's won a championship. And on the defensive side of the football, Todd Bowles is a pressure kind of coach. Now, he's not technically the defensive coordinator. He's the head coach, but we know he calls the plays defensively. This team understands who they are and who they want to be. And I think the Buccaneers at their highest can be a 12-win team. Now, the Dallas Cowboys, if you see here their ceiling being 15 wins and their floor being 8 losses, that tells you, in my opinion, I think the Cowboys can be a Super Bowl contender. Because I think if everything goes the way it should go, if Dak Prescott has a year like he had last year, which he was one of the best quarterbacks, best players in the NFL and in the MVP voting, they're that good. Offensively, they got weapons everywhere. And I think bringing back Ezekiel Elliott this year is going to mean a lot. And a lot of people say, well, what does it mean it's a one-year deal? I think it immediately makes them better in the red zone. Defensively, when you look at the Cowboys, they're phenomenal when it comes to their pass rush. They're phenomenal in the secondary. They were even still good with the loss of Trayvon Diggs to injury last year because they had guys like Deron Bland on the other side who led the league in pick sixes. So I think the Cowboys are phenomenal. But if you make the Cowboys have to play the run, which they don't do well, and they didn't do well under Dan Quinn, and now Dan Quinn has since left and went to Washington, and now you have Mike Zimmer as a defensive coordinator, that's where I think the Cowboys can be a little susceptible to being beaten. But at their worst, they're an 8-loss team. So even if they have a poor season, I think you may still see them in the playoffs as a wild card team. I look at the Detroit Lions the exact same way. And who would have thought this? Who would have thought that the Detroit Lions, even when Dan Campbell got there and they were terrible in his first year, he's built a culture of stability. Why do I think the Lions can be a 15-win team? Because they are physical and they are talented. Not many teams can say both. I'm going to tell you the truth. The team they lost to in the NFC Championship game last year, the San Francisco 49ers, are a lot who the Detroit Lions remind me of, right? They've got a quarterback who's good enough, who doesn't make mistakes, who just got a contract extension. They run the ball very well with a dual running back system. They've got receivers everywhere, and their defense runs after the football, and they tackle 11 men to the football. That's something that's an identity that Dan Campbell has instilled in his football team, and I think at their best, they can be a 15-win team. All right, let's go to the next team here. The Miami Dolphins. Josiah, one of the producers of the show, asked me before the show, what can the Dolphins do to get over the hump? And I simply think that the Dolphins have to be better when they play better teams. I know it sounds simplistic, but that's the true answer. You don't have a Christian Wilkinson now. You don't have a Raekwon Davis. You don't have a Robert Hunt. I just gave you 3 individuals along the interior of their offensive defensive line that they no longer have. We know that they have a track meet on the offensive side of the football. But if the Dolphins want to get over the hump, they have to find a way to be better than just good. They beat teams that don't have winning records, and they can't beat teams that do. They have to be better than that. And the Buffalo Bills, the team that actually won the AFC East last year, when Ken Dorsey got fired and Joe Brady came in, their identity changed. They became a run-first team and used play action with Josh Allen's phenomenal arm and his phenomenal run abilities. I think even the loss of Hoyer at safety is going to be big for the Buffalo Bills, but I do think when you have a guy like Josh Allen, you can do a lot. So the Buffalo Bills, in my estimation, are a team that can win 14, maybe even 15 games at their highest, and even at their worst, they're still probably a playoff team. All right, that's my ceiling and my floor. We're going to go to second down, and you know what that means. More social media questions. We'll be right back with more show right after this. And welcome back into the show. And before we get started, I just want to remind everybody that it's a blessing to be here. I want to thank everybody for watching Move the Chains. And once again, I want to thank the production team, the best in the business, for everything that they do behind the scenes. I just want to take time to thank everybody who helps make Move the Chains happen. So it's time for your social media questions, and I know you love asking questions. And listen, there's a lot of vitriol that comes my way on my takes that I have because some people think that I'm too far which way against their team, or they think that I'm making things up just to be a contrarian. Remember, I don't do those things. I think the way I think and believe what I believe, and if it happens to be in the minority, your boy is cool with that. So let's go ahead and kick it off, man. It's time for second down. All right, so we're here with social media questions. Let's go ahead and kick it off with our first question for today. Donald T. asks, is Kyle Shanahan really a top-tier head coach? Donald, it's funny that you ask this question because the fact that this is a question to me is a little bit ludicrous. I don't mind you asking the question because I know that there's a sentiment amongst a lot of people in NFL circles on whether or not Kyle Shanahan is a top-tier head coach. The answer is yes. And yes, it may be sometimes hard to say he's a top-tier head coach when he hasn't won a Super Bowl. I'll simply say this. There are a lot of basketball Hall of Famers, players and coaches, that have not won a championship because of Michael Jordan. There will be a lot of NFL Hall of Famers, players and head coaches, that don't win an NFL championship, a.k.a. a Super Bowl, because of Patrick Mahomes and Andy Reid. And Kyle Shanahan has had to deal with that directly. Twice. I'm not making excuses. He could have won both of those games. I think if Kyle Shanahan is better in some situational football moments in those games, he may come out on top. What I'm telling you is Patrick Mahomes is one of the best quarterbacks to ever play the game already. Andy Reid is one of the best coaches to have ever coached in the NFL. Those are the people that it has taken to beat Kyle Shanahan and the 49ers. And remember, the 49ers last season were one of the best teams in the NFL, ended up getting the number 1 seed in the NFC playoffs. He's also gone to the Super Bowl with a team that's barely made it to the playoffs as a wild card. Kyle Shanahan can coach. He can construct a roster with he and John Lynch, the GM. He just hasn't been able to get over the proverbial hump of the Kansas City Chiefs via Patrick Mahomes and Andy Reid. And I won't criticize him and kill him as he's not a top-tier coach because of that reason. All right, what do we have next? What do you consider to be the second most important position on an NFL team? From Thaddeus S. So a lot of people, one, quarterback is the most important position on the football field and in sports, in my estimation. So a lot of people like to say, well, is it a wide receiver or is it an edge rusher to be able to get after the quarterback, or does he have somebody to throw to? I think those could be viable options, but to me it always starts in the trenches on that offensive line. So I think an offensive lineman, especially a solid right and left tackle, is the most important position after a quarterback on an NFL team. And I just want to remind everybody of Andrew Luck. Remember, the number 1 pick out of Stanford. Everybody considered him the best draft pick since John Elway. He was transcendent, and he was, until the life got knocked out of him as an NFL quarterback because the Colts tried to make every other position viable for Andrew Luck other than the offensive line. His career was short. If you look at Joe Burrow, in the 4 full seasons he's been in the NFL, he's only finished the season twice. That's 50%. And the Bengals have tried to address the offensive line. and they haven't been able to do it, whether it's been through free agency or whether it's been through the draft. They've tried, and I think they've gotten a little better, but he's still one of the most hit quarterbacks in the NFL. If you have a quarterback who can lead you to the promised land of a Super Bowl or even to the playoffs, and you want him to stay upright, you have to develop a cohesive and a very good offensive line. No wall up front means your quarterback will likely come crashing down. You saw that with 25% of the starting quarterbacks in the NFL last year going down due to injury. All right, what do we have here? Will T. Higgins be a Bengal when the NFL season starts? Wendell H. Wendell, I think he will be, and it's because of the franchise tag. And listen, this is a situation where I don't blame the player and I don't blame the team. If you're the player like T. Higgins, who's getting about $21 million a year right now, you want to be paid like a top-tier receiver because he is a top-tier receiver. He may be a number 2 on the Bengals because they have Jamar Chase, but trust me, he could go to 15 or 20 other teams and be the best receiver and thrive in that role. I don't blame the Bengals because they want to keep him, which is why they have to franchise tag him. So I think that T. Higgins will end up on the Bengals this year, even though I know he's requested a trade. Just because he's requested a trade doesn't mean the Bengals have to grant it. I don't think they will, and I think you'll see him in the stripes when the 2024 season opens. All right, great questions, and that's enough for your questions. When we come back, it'll be Nonsense Narratives, my favorite part of the show. We'll be back when we'll move the chains right after this. And welcome back into the show. There are so many things that I think about on a day-to-day basis, and I think about how I want to communicate them, and how do I want to present this to you, the fans, and how do I want to make this plausible, and how do I want to make it viable to your ear and your heart. And the Nonsense Narratives, I think it allows me to do that because even in my anger, and a lot of times when I created this segment, it allows me to voice my opinion on topics that I think a lot of people just let fly by. They know the topics are going on, they know the conversations are happening, but I don't think they really think about it to the level in which I think they should. And that sounds presumptive of me. I know that may sound bad, but I'm really just talking about these opportunities to really look at a situation for what it is. So let's go ahead and kick off this week's Nonsense Narrative. Coach of the Year. When I hear Player of the Year, it generally goes to the best player, right? When I hear MVP, best player. When I hear Most Improved Player, it goes to the player who may have been the best out of what he or she was last year. Like they made a huge improvement in whatever it is that they're doing. So when I hear Coach of the Year, I want to see a coach that to me was the best coach. Now, I'll just go ahead and say this. Does being the best coach mean that you went undefeated? No. I understand things happen, and sometimes being the best coach has to illustrate what you were able to overcome. I have no problem with that. But the problem I have is that I think going into the season, when people predict that a team will be good, when people predict a team will be the AFC champion or they'll win their division or what have you, that coach is immediately taken out of the running of Coach of the Year, and I think that's wrong. Now, we've had a graphic that we've created for the past Coach of the Year awards. I appreciate you guys in the back for getting this up. So AP means Associated Press Coach of the Year winners. And I want you to look at this list, and I go through all the way back to 2014. You had Bruce Arians when he was the coach of the Cardinals. Now, Bruce Arians, I think, has always been an underrated coach. He's phenomenal. He helped lead the Tampa Bay Buccaneers to a Super Bowl win, and then he stepped away and allowed Todd Bowles to move into that position. I think Bruce Arians is a solid football guy. Ron Rivera has always been one of my favorite coaches. Remember that year. Now, this was a year that I kind of liked the head coach of the Year award because in 2015, the Panthers, I think, 14-2, ended up going to the Super Bowl. So this may be an outlier. But every other year, a lot of times, Coach of the Year winners come from teams who are expected not to do so much, and because they overachieved, they won Coach of the Year awards. It's the same thing with MVPs in basketball, and I use this every time, or even in football. You know there's a such thing as called fatigue, right? There's voter fatigue. And because a lot of people get tired of voting for the same people, they'll say, well, just because Patrick Mahomes has already won 2 MVPs, it shouldn't be his turn. Or Lamar Jackson's already won 2 MVPs, it's not his turn. So they look for somebody at the end of a previous season, and they give him the MVP nod coming into the season, and it's his to lose. I think it's the same thing with the Coach of the Year award. If the Coach of the Year award was truly a Coach of the Year award, let's look at the entire season, and let's look at what a team has done. So just because the team was expected to be great and they ended up being great that shouldn't disqualify a coach from being the coach of the year. I think Brian Daboll did a phenomenal job in 2022 with the New York Giants. And I don't think it matters how they faltered in 2023. But I think I can look at 3, 4, 5 more people in 2022 that could have won Coach of the Year over Brian Daboll. But because it was his first year with the Giants, you didn't know what you were going to expect from the Giants, and he ended up leading them to the playoffs, you made him Coach of the Year. I'm not saying he wasn't a deserving candidate. What I'm simply saying is let's not just assume that because somebody, one, hasn't won the award before, or two, hasn't been in contention because their team isn't supposed to be good, doesn't mean that they should be vaulted to the top of the Coach of the Year award. All right, ladies and gentlemen, that's my nonsense narrative. I want you to take that and run with it. All right, when we come back, it'll be the final segment of the show, and you know what that means. It'll be the final drive when we come back with more Move the Chains right after this. And welcome back into the show. This is the final segment of Move the Chains this week, and you know what that means. It's time for the final drive. Let's run it. Production will always trump potential. I don't care what you say. Don't care what you tell me. You won't get me off this hill. There are so many players in the NFL, specifically quarterbacks, that people put in the top 10 in their list and the top 5 in their list strictly based on potential. Well, this guy's 6'5", 220. He has a rocket of an arm. He can run. All that's great. But if you don't produce with that, what does that mean? Doesn't that sort of make you an underachiever? And I think this is the whole epitome of the Brock Purdy argument. Brock Purdy isn't the fastest, isn't the strongest, doesn't have the strongest arm, but just produces at a high level. Now, do I think Brock Purdy is a top-tier quarterback? Not necessarily from talent-wise, but he produces. So if you're producing for me, I will vault you over anybody else with potential or with talent who's not producing. Remember, the name of the game is production. The name of the game is winning. The name of the game is putting up numbers that are conducive to helping your team win. So if you're simply having the potential, a.k.a. a Justin Herbert, right, a.k.a. a Trevor Lawrence, and you aren't necessarily producing at a high level, I'm not going to put you up there until you've done it. And I think it's okay. You guys can pay the quarterbacks all the money in the world before they produce, but I'm going to wait until they produce to consider them top-tier quarterbacks. They can be good. They can have all the potential in the world, but I'm not going to put them at the top of my list, which is why I've said to this day that there are 2 premier quarterbacks in the NFL right now, in my opinion. That's Patrick Mahomes and Lamar Jackson. All right, don't forget, not only on WXTX Fox 54, the sports leader, can you check out Move the Chains. You can also go to our YouTube channel, and the YouTube channel is @move_the_chains. Don't forget to leave a comment, put all your questions, what you loved and what you didn't love, because they could become a part of the show next week. All right, it's been a blessing. You know what time it is. We're wrapping it up. I'm your boy, Jonathan Bam Rivers. For everybody back in production, I want to tell you guys thank you. God bless, and see you next time.